March 15, 1959, Attica Penitentiary. Frank, the Bull. Malone watched the new prisoner walk through the gates, Bumpy Johnson, transferred from Harlem. Frank smiled with contempt, his thick arms crossed over his barrel chest, a cigarette dangling from his lip like a permanent sneer. He turned to his men, the collection of broken souls who'd learned that survival meant serving him. "I give him a week before he's begging me for protection," Frank said, his voice carrying that particular confidence of a man who'd never been challenged in 8 years. His men laughed, the hollow sound of people who laugh because silence is dangerous. None of them imagined that 6 months later it would be Frank begging for a transfer, his voice cracking like thin ice under weight, his eyes hollow with something none of them had ever seen in him before. Absolute terror. Frank Malone controlled Attica the way a wolf controls its territory, through teeth and the promise of blood. Convicted of crimes so violent that even hardened criminals whispered about them in tones usually reserved for ghost stories, he'd been sentenced to life without parole. But life behind bars hadn't diminished him. It had concentrated him, distilled his violence into something purer, more efficient. He didn't just command the prisoners. He intimidated guards who'd seen decades of hard men, controlled contraband pipelines that seemed to operate by magic, dictated rules that superseded the warden's own orders. Even the prison director, a man who'd broken riots with his bare presence, avoided confronting Frank directly. The Bull's reputation was built on 8 years of absolute fear and violence so unpredictable that even his own men never knew when the storm would break. A man could smile at Frank in the morning and be carried out on a stretcher by afternoon, his face rearranged into something his own mother wouldn't recognize. That was power in Attica. That was law. When Bumpy Johnson walked through those gates that March morning, Frank gathered his gang like a general assembling troops before battle. They stood in the yard, 20 men who'd learned to move as one predatory unit. "That one there is supposed to be the king of Harlem," Frank announced, his voice dripping with mockery. "We're going to show him who runs things in here. Prison ain't the street. Out there, maybe he was something. In here, I'm God, and he's about to learn religion." His men laughed again, that same hollow sound, but underneath it was genuine confidence. They'd seen Frank break men who came in with reputations. They'd watched him reduce legends to whimpering children. This would be no different. Bumpy just stood near the entrance, hands relaxed at his sides, observing everything with the calm attention of a man reading a newspaper. He didn't look frightened. He didn't look defiant. He just looked like someone taking notes. What none of them knew about Frank Malone, what even the guards who'd watched him for 8 years hadn't discovered, was that behind the mask of pure brutality lived secrets. Secrets that existed in darkness so complete that daylight had never touched them. Secrets that could demolish his reputation faster than a wrecking ball through glass. The kind of secrets that would make his men question everything, that would turn his army into a firing squad aimed at him. And Bumpy Johnson, even before he'd set foot in Attica, already knew every single one of them. He'd spent months preparing for this, turning over rocks that most people didn't even know existed, following threads that seemed to disappear into nothing until you knew exactly where to look. Bumpy had looked, Bumpy had found, and now Bumpy was standing in Frank's kingdom carrying knowledge like a loaded weapon that nobody could see. 3 months before the transfer, Bumpy was still in Harlem awaiting trial. The courtroom was a formality. Everyone knew he was going away. The only question was where. When his lawyer told him the likely destination was Attica, Bumpy didn't curse or complain. Instead, something happened that made his lawyer uncomfortable. Bumpy smiled. Not a nervous smile or a bitter one. A genuine smile of satisfaction, like a chess player who'd just seen the winning move 20 plays ahead. That afternoon, Bumpy made a phone call from a payphone 3 blocks from the courthouse. "Jerome," he said when the line connected, his voice calm as Sunday morning, "I need you to find out everything about who runs Attica. And I don't mean the warden. I mean who really runs it. Everything, Jerome. Find the cavities. Every man has cavities in his teeth, places where rot hides until you shine light directly on it. I need you to find those cavities and bring me a map of every single one." Jerome was the kind of man who could find out what you ate for breakfast 3 years ago if you gave him a week and enough reason to look. He understood that information was currency more valuable than money, that knowing things other people wanted hidden was better than gold. He took 6 weeks, but when he came back to meet Bumpy in the visiting room of the holding facility, he carried a folder that looked thin but felt heavy. Frank Malone wasn't just a violent racist gang leader. He had a sister living in Syracuse under a false name, trying to escape the shadow of her brother's reputation. He had gambling debts that ate up money like fire eats paper, debts that family members paid monthly to keep collectors from turning violent. He had secrets about his original sentencing, details about the case that, if revealed, would destroy the carefully constructed image of an untouchable man. The official story said one thing, but Jerome's research had found 3 witnesses whose testimony never made it to trial, testimony that would have changed everything if anyone had known to look for it. But the most devastating secret lived in Buffalo. Frank Malone, the white supremacist who preached racial purity like a twisted gospel, who'd beaten black men unconscious for looking at him wrong, who controlled Attica through racist violence that made segregation look polite, had a 6-year-old son in Buffalo, a child he'd never met personally, had never acknowledged publicly, never sent money to or letters or even photographs. The boy was the result of a relationship that contradicted everything Frank preached inside those walls, everything his reputation was built on. Only the child's mother and 2 lawyers knew the truth. They'd been paid very well to keep it buried. Now Bumpy knew too. And knowledge like that in the right hands was more dangerous than any knife you could sharpen on a prison floor. First day in Attica. The refectory at 6:30 in the evening. That particular time when hunger made men dangerous and crowds made violence spread like wildfire. Frank approached Bumpy's table with 5 of his biggest men, moving with the confidence of a man who'd never lost a confrontation in this building. "I heard you were important in Harlem, old man," Frank said, his voice loud enough to carry across nearby tables. Eyes turned toward them. Conversations died. "But in here, you're nothing. Less than nothing. You better pick a side real quick and pick the right one." Bumpy continued eating his meal, some unidentifiable meat and potatoes that tasted like cafeteria resignation. He didn't look up, didn't stop chewing, didn't acknowledge Frank's presence beyond the slight pause of someone hearing background noise that wasn't quite interesting enough to investigate. "I'm talking to you," Frank shouted, and his hand shot out to knock Bumpy's tray off the table. Food splattered across the floor. The entire cafeteria went silent, that terrible silence that comes right before violence, when even breathing sounds too loud. Everyone expected what came next. They'd seen it before. Frank would grab the man, throw him against something hard, beat him until guards intervened or until Frank got bored. It was ritual. It was law. It was how things worked. But Bumpy just looked down at the spilled food, then slowly raised his eyes to meet Frank's face. His expression was calm, almost curious, like someone discovering something mildly interesting. "Frank Malone, right?" Bumpy said, his voice conversational, the tone you'd use asking about weather. 8 years here, that's impressive. Must be difficult being so far from Buffalo this time of year, isn't it? Frank's expression changed for just a fraction of a second. Most people wouldn't have caught it. His men didn't, but Bumpy saw it because he'd been waiting for it. That tiny crack in the armor, that microscopic flinch that said the arrow had found its target. "What are you talking about, old man?" Frank's voice tried to sound confident, but there was something underneath now, something that hadn't been there 3 seconds ago. "Nothing specific," Bumpy said, his tone remaining perfectly gentle, almost friendly. "Just commenting that Buffalo's beautiful in spring. So much space for children to run around and play, especially for a 6-year-old. Plenty of room to grow up strong and healthy, don't you think?" The color drained from Frank's face like someone had opened a valve. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. His hands, which had been balled into fists ready for violence, slowly uncurled. Around them, men watched with confusion, trying to understand what had just happened. Why the bull suddenly looked like he'd been shot. Frank took a step backward. It was involuntary, Instinctive, the body's response to sudden danger. His men noticed immediately. You don't survive in prison without learning to read your leader's signals, and Frank had just sent a signal none of them had ever seen before. Retreat. You don't know anything, Frank whispered, but his voice shook like leaves before a storm. The confidence from 30 seconds ago had evaporated completely. Bumpy smiled, the kind of gentle smile a grandfather gives a confused child. I know that you want to keep certain things private, Frank. I respect privacy, I think it's important. And as long as there's mutual respect between us, I'm happy to help maintain that privacy. Seems fair, doesn't it? Frank didn't answer. He just turned and walked away, his men following with backward glances at Bumpy, trying to understand what invisible weapon had just been deployed. That night, Frank couldn't sleep. He lay in his cell staring at the ceiling, listening to the sounds of prison darkness, snoring and distant shouting and the endless drip of a broken pipe somewhere in the walls. His mind wouldn't stop circling the same questions. How did Bumpy know? Who told him? Who else knew? Frank had protected that secret for years, built walls around it higher than Attica's own perimeter. He'd paid lawyers good money, threatened the child's mother with consequences if she ever spoke, moved heaven and earth to keep that information buried. And now this man who'd walked through the gates 8 hours ago knew his most vulnerable point. Frank understood something in that sleepless darkness, something that made his stomach feel like it was full of broken glass. He wasn't safe anymore, not even in his own kingdom, especially not in his own kingdom, because kingdoms are only as strong as the secrets they keep. And his biggest secret was now held by a man he'd just tried to humiliate. Day 2. Frank tried to reassert control. He had to. His men were already asking questions with their eyes, if not their mouths. So he ordered them to intimidate Bumpy in the yard during exercise hour, to surround him and make it clear that yesterday was a fluke. 6 men approached Bumpy while he stood near the fence looking at the sky, like a man who had all the time in the world. But before they could speak, before they could move into their standard intimidation formation, Bumpy turned and looked at each of them in sequence. Then he started talking. He spoke names: Marcus Williams, Tommy Rodriguez, James Sullivan, Devin Carter, Pete Kowalski, Michael Chen, their names. Then he spoke other names: Linda Williams, mother in Detroit; Rosa Rodriguez, sister in San Antonio; Catherine Sullivan, wife and 2 kids in Boston; Sharon Carter, girlfriend who didn't know about the wife in Georgia; Anna Kowalski, daughter starting college next fall; Mei Chen, mother running restaurant in Chinatown. The men froze. Bumpy wasn't threatening them. He was just reciting information, the way a teacher might read a roll call. But every word landed like a punch, because it meant he knew. He knew where their people were. He knew who mattered to them. He knew exactly where to apply pressure if pressure became necessary. The 6 men backed away without being told to, and Frank watched from across the yard, helpless. That afternoon, Bumpy found Frank in the corridor between the library and the workshow P's, a narrow space where echoes made everything sound closer than it was. You know, Frank, Bumpy said conversationally, as if continuing a discussion they'd been having about sports, Syracuse is a small city. Quiet, good place to disappear if you want to start over. Your sister Mary Ellen has been there about 7 years now, hasn't she? Living under the name Thompson. Works at General Hospital, night shift nurse. Admirable woman from what I hear. Takes care of people, keeps her head down, doesn't cause trouble. It would be terrible if something compromised her peace, if people started asking questions about her past, about why she changed her name, about who her family is. Small cities like Syracuse, word travels fast once it starts traveling. Frank's hands were shaking. He pressed them against the wall to make them stop, but they kept trembling anyway. What do you want? The question came out desperate, all pretense of control abandoned. Frank sounded like a man drowning, trying to grab anything that might float. Bumpy's expression remained gentle, almost kind. Me? I don't want anything, Frank. I just want to serve my time in peace. No drama, no artificial hierarchies, no men trying to prove something that doesn't need proving. You leave me alone. I keep certain information private. It's a simple arrangement. Gentlemen helping each other out. You scratch my back by leaving me alone. I scratch yours by staying quiet. Seems fair." Frank nodded without speaking. What else could he do? Bumpy walked away, and Frank stood in that corridor for 10 minutes after, just standing there, feeling the walls close in even though they hadn't moved an inch. Day 3 brought visible changes to anyone paying attention. Frank's gang began noticing their leader's behavior had shifted. He avoided Bumpy completely, walking different paths through the yard, choosing different meal times, finding excuses to be elsewhere whenever Bumpy entered a room. He stopped giving orders about the new prisoner. When men asked if they should continue pressure, Frank snapped at them. "Leave him alone. We've got bigger problems." But there weren't bigger problems. There was just one problem growing inside Frank like cancer, eating away at his confidence, his sleep, his sense of security. Fear is a patient predator. It doesn't need to rush. It just waits for you to realize there's no escape, and then it settles in permanently. Day 4. Bumpy began making friends naturally, the way some people do without trying. He talked with other prisoners, not recruiting or building alliances, just having conversations. He listened when people spoke, really listened instead of waiting for his turn to talk. He offered advice when asked, always thoughtful, never pushy. Men started seeking him out to help resolve disputes, to negotiate trades, to provide perspective on problems. Bumpy never used violence or threats. He used intelligence, empathy, genuine respect for people regardless of what they'd done to end up here. These were things Frank had never offered in 8 years. Frank ruled through fear. Bumpy led through connection. The difference became more apparent every day. Day 5 marked the moment Frank realized he was losing control. Men who used to flinch when he walked past now barely noticed him. Guards who used to avoid him now had relaxed conversations with Bumpy in plain sight. The entire power structure Frank had built through 8 years of calculated violence was crumbling, and he couldn't do anything to stop it without risking exposure of his secrets. He was trapped in a cage inside a cage, and both were getting smaller. That evening, Frank confronted Bumpy in the library, a room Frank rarely visited because reading felt like weakness to him. "How did you get all this information? Who works for you on the outside?" His voice was aggressive, but his eyes were desperate. Bumpy closed the book he'd been reading, some history of ancient Rome, and looked up calmly. "Frank, I don't need people working for me. Information flows naturally when you treat people with respect, when you understand that everyone is connected to everyone else somehow. It's something you never understood. You built walls. I built bridges. Walls keep things out but also trap you inside. Bridges let you move freely. But the gambling debts, Buffalo, Syracuse, how did you find all that?" Frank's voice was rising, desperation making him loud. Bumpy's voice stayed level, quiet, forcing Frank to lean in to hear properly. "You think power comes from fists and fear? That's where you're wrong. Real power comes from understanding that every person is part of a network, a web. You pull one thread here, something responds over there. You built an empire on fear because you were afraid. Afraid of weakness, afraid of truth, afraid of being human. I built a network of information because I understood something simple. People talk to people who listen to them. You never listened, Frank. You just hit. I listened. I learned. Now guess whose power lasts longer?" Day 6. Frank was visibly falling apart. He barely ate, pushing food around his tray without interest. He didn't sleep more than an hour at a time, waking with gasps from dreams where his secrets spread like wildfire through the prison, through Syracuse, through Buffalo, through everywhere. His hands shook constantly now. He jumped at shadows. His men began questioning openly. "Boss, what's happening? Why are you letting that old man run things?" Frank had no answer that wouldn't admit weakness. Admitting fear would be the end. But staying silent was also the end. He was checkmate in a game he didn't fully understand. That afternoon during free time in the yard, something happened that nobody expected. One of Frank's men, a young guy named Danny who hadn't learned subtlety yet, decided to challenge Bumpy publicly. Maybe he thought it would wake Frank up. Maybe he thought it would restore order. Maybe he was just stupid. "You think you're smart, old man? In here, respect is earned different. Talk doesn't mean nothing." He stepped close to Bumpy, fists ready. Before anything could happen, before Danny could throw a punch or even finish his threat, Frank ran across the yard. Not walked, ran. He grabbed his own man and pulled him back forcefully. "Leave him alone," Frank ordered, his voice cracking. Danny looked confused. "But boss, he's—" "I said leave him," Frank shouted, and there was something in his voice none of them had heard before. Panic. The entire gang stood shocked. Frank Malone, the bull, the man who'd never shown weakness in 8 years, had just protected the new prisoner. Questions exploded silently in every man's mind. Why would Frank protect someone he'd threatened 3 days ago? What had changed? What did this man have on their boss? Frank couldn't answer because any answer would reveal too much, so he just walked away quickly, and his men watched him go with expressions that mixed confusion and the first seeds of doubt. Bumpy observed everything calmly, saying nothing, doing nothing. He didn't need to. Frank was destroying himself through his own fear, dismantling 8 years of reputation one panicked decision at a time. Day 7. The week Frank had promised Bumpy wouldn't survive reached its end, but the man destroyed wasn't Bumpy. That morning Frank went to the prison director's office. "I need a transfer," he said without preamble. The director looked up from paperwork, surprised. "A transfer? Malone, you've been here 8 years. You run this place. What changed?" Frank couldn't meet his eyes. How could he explain without exposing everything? How could he admit that a man who'd been here 7 days had completely dismantled his empire using only information and implied threats? "Personal reasons," Frank mumbled. "I need to be closer to family." The director actually laughed. "Family? You haven't had a visitor in 8 years. Christmas, birthdays, nothing. What family?" Frank felt the trap of his own lies closing. Every explanation he could offer would raise more questions. The gambling debts? That would mean admitting illegal activity. Syracuse? That would mean admitting the sister he'd never mentioned. Buffalo? That would mean admitting the secret that would destroy everything. "Just please transfer me," Frank said, and the word please coming from his mouth was so historically unprecedented that the director stared at him like he'd spoken in a foreign language. Meanwhile, Bumpy had established a completely new dynamic in Attica. Without violence, without direct threats, using only strategic knowledge and genuine respect, he'd become the man people turned to. Prisoners sought his advice. Guards talked with him openly. He didn't lead through intimidation. He led because people chose to follow him, because following him felt safer and more dignified than following fear. It was a fundamental difference Frank had never understood, and now watched helplessly from the outside. Weeks passed. Frank's transfer request was denied 3 times. Without adequate justification, request refused. Each rejection felt like another year added to his sentence. Frank was trapped in the hell he'd created, forced to watch his former empire serve Bumpy voluntarily, while every night insomnia consumed him with visions of when, not if, his secrets would be exposed. 2 months after Bumpy's arrival, Frank had a complete nervous breakdown in the refectory. He started screaming about conspiracies that didn't exist, accusing men of plots that weren't real, seeing threats in every glance. Guards had to physically restrain him while he fought and shouted and cried. They sent him to the psychiatric wing for 2 weeks. When he returned, he was a shadow. The bull was broken completely, reduced to something that shuffled through corridors with eyes that didn't focus on anything anymore. Bumpy never visited Frank in the psychiatric wing, never sent messages, never made additional threats. He didn't need to. The knowledge that Bumpy knew was torture enough. Fear of what might happen consumed Frank more completely than any action could. Bumpy had understood this from the beginning. Knowledge is absolute power. An implied threat is more devastating than executed violence, because imagination is always worse than reality. 4 months later, miraculously, Frank's transfer was approved. He was sent to a medium-security prison in Montana, far from everything and everyone. Nobody understood how the approval suddenly came through after multiple denials. But Bumpy knew. He'd facilitated it. Not from mercy or kindness or forgiveness. He'd done it because Frank destroyed in Attica was a more powerful lesson than Frank dead would ever be. Living proof that true power doesn't come from fists or fear. It comes from knowledge, connection, understanding. The day Frank left, 6 months after Bumpy's arrival, he passed by Bumpy's cell one final time. He stopped, looked inside. Bumpy sat reading calmly, the same way he'd been reading that first night. Frank stood there for a long moment. "Why didn't you destroy me completely? You could have exposed everything." Bumpy looked up from his book, his expression thoughtful. "Destruction wasn't the goal, Frank. Transformation was. You needed to learn something. You built power on fear because you were afraid," Bumpy continued, his voice gentle but firm. "Afraid of weakness, of truth, of your own humanity. I let you see that real power comes from knowledge and respect, from understanding people rather than breaking them. The lesson was worth more than your destruction. You'll carry it to Montana. You'll carry it everywhere you go now. You'll never forget that the strongest walls are made of respect, not fear." Frank nodded silently, tears running down his face, cutting paths through dirt and defeat. He walked away for the last time. Bumpy returned to his book about ancient Rome, about empires that fell because they relied on fear instead of loyalty. The lesson was complete. Attica had a new order now, one built on something more lasting than violence. And Frank Malone would spend the rest of his life understanding what he'd lost when he mistook fear for power.